Welcome to YMT 220 Economics. We are still discussing the market, but from today we'll discuss it from another perspective that is actually linked or connected to consumers, producers, and we study the market in terms of its own efficiency. So, in today's class, this is the first part of chapter 7. We will just have two parts of it. So this is the first part. I'll have another session for the second part. So we will have main questions to address and discuss. We will discuss the concept of consumer surplus and what's its relation or how is it related to the demand curve. We will do the same to producer surplus and how it is linked not to the demand, actually in this case to the supply curve, because as you know that demand is always related to consumers, and supply is always related to producers. Now, the main question that we will be interested in addressing is actually whether our markets on their own are efficient or not, or if the free markets are efficient or not, or is there any way we can improve the market if it is free? And you know the definition of a free market. The market with no interference will leave producers and consumers, or buyers and sellers, to decide the prices based on the demand and supply somewhere at the equilibrium, and we will see whether that's efficient or not. So we will try to answer these questions. Before that, we need to have some definitions clarified or stated. Before we define anything, let me just remind you with the allocation of resources. And we said about the economy, usually we study scarce resources. We speak about scarce resources, limited resources. So how can we allocate them? Or what's the mechanism for allocating these resources? Or what kind of subheading when we address the allocation of resources? We have to think about the amount of the good or services to be produced, or how much of it is produced. Okay, how about who's producing it? Okay, and who's consuming it? These three main, you can say, questions or points should be addressed while discussing the allocation of resources. Why? Because it will determine what we call the welfare of economics. So welfare of economics is exactly the study of how the resources are being allocated, and not in any just manner, no, in a manner that affects the whole economy well-being. So we think about the economy well-being, whether our economy is efficient or not, whether the distribution of the resources or the allocation of the resources is efficient. All right, so we need to look into these based on the well-being of consumers and the well-being of producers. Then after that, we have the overall view based on both of them, the consumers and the producers. So first of all, we need to go through a concept we call willingness to pay. Imagine yourself as a buyer. Now, if you are going to buy a product, you would always wish that it is cheaper. You would be interested in paying less. However, the seller has the opposite mentality or the opposite view, would wish for having a higher price for it. Well, this is normal in market. Why? Because your interest actually goes along with having the product or the service with a lower price, while the interest of the seller or the producer is actually goes along with selling it by a higher price. So what's the willingness to pay? The willingness to pay actually, or can be defined by simple words, is that the maximum amount that a buyer or the one who's demanding the stuff or the service or the good will be paying for it, or the maximum price that the buyer is willing to pay for a product or a service. That's the meaning of the willingness to pay. We usually refer to it by WTP as an abbreviation, and it depends. There are many factors actually affected. We are not going to address them now, but the willingness to pay varies based on your financial ability, based on your appreciation of the item, based on your need for it, what kind of need you have. Is it a necessity or some basic need, etc. Okay. So then let's just address a simple example illustration. Just for illustration, this is an illustrative example. Think about, let's say, the willingness to pay for an iPod, or you can apply it to any modern thing other than an iPod. Let's say we have these four consumers, and we have their list of willingness to pay, or WTPs here in this case. Anthony is willing to pay 250, put the currency you like. Chad is willing to pay 175. Flea is willing to pay 300. John is willing to pay 125. Now, as I said, these values of WTP vary based on their interests and appreciation, and also the need of the item, okay? Plus their financial ability, because our willingness to pay, as I said, is affected by different factors. All right, so what interests us here? The idea is like we can address the price of the iPod and see who can buy it. If we say the price of the iPod is 200, so who can buy it? Anthony and Flea. For Chad and John, their willingness to pay is less than the price available for an iPod, and in that case they will not be able to buy it. So, and now we have some sense of this kind of representation. Now let's just move a bit and see. So at the price of 200, we have two buyers willing and able to buy the product. Let's just move and see how things can be formulated. Now what we have is something we call the demand schedule. We studied this before, but we have a bit different scenario in this case. What we do is we start from the highest available price, or willingness to pay here, in this case not price, I'm sorry, willingness to pay here, WTP, and we say higher than it by 1 unit and up. So here the highest one is what? Flea 300. So we say 301 and up. So higher than this price. That means higher than 300 in basic sense, okay? Who's willing to pay? Nobody, okay? And the quantity demanded is 0. No one is demanding any, because of the willingness to pay of all of them is less than the price of the iPod. Sorry. Okay. So let's take the second stage. Let's take the second biggest willingness to pay, or WTP, and take a higher than it by 1 unit, and then until the next highest, the first highest, or the highest of all. So 251 here, 250 will be 251 until or through 300. So all these, we will have only one person interested and willing to pay, and in that case the quantity demanded is 1. Apply to next, who's the second highest, third highest, 175. So 176 to 200, we will have 2 Anthony and Flea, and it goes along like this. Okay, if you apply again 126, we will have these 3. Okay, Chad, Anthony, and Flea, 3. Finally, from 0 to 125, we will have, now the lowest price possible theoretically is 0, because 0 is not a price, but I mean theoretically it can be. And in that case, we would have from 0 to 125, all of them are interested, and the demand, or the demanded quantity, is 4. So you may question, or you may think, why do we need this schedule? For what? We need to draw the demand curve, and now this is the idea. Now look, based on this, what we need to do, 0, the quantity demanded is 0, anything above 300. So what will it be? 0 above 300, something like this, until 300 is not actually inclusive. Once we reach to 300, what happens? Now look, 1 is demanded. So here 0, until we reach to 300, we have 1. Once we are at this level of 300, we will have 1. So it will keep on moving as a step. Okay, so we will have 1. And then think about the price less. So between 176 and 250, now we have what? We will just keep on moving down because the price is dropping exactly as a step. Then we will have 2. So we proceed, or we move horizontal in this case. So we have the horizontal direction to move along. Then again, we apply the same 126 to 175. So we have to drop the price down. We go a step down here, okay, until we reach 126, okay. And in that case, what will we have? 176. And in that case, we will have 126. I'm sorry, I delayed one step. Okay, we will have 3. And in that case, exactly, this is what we are trying to represent. Just a staircase based on the representation here starts by 0, no quantity demanded at all. When we reach to 300, we have only 1, and it remains until 250. So it remains 1 the way it is until 250. Then we drop down and move to 3. Okay, why? If the price drops down until 250, then we have 2. Again, if the price drops down to 175, we will have 3. 125, we will have 4. And then we will have a straight line here until whatever. If the price also drops down, we will just have the same 4, because this is the quantity demanded. It doesn't matter, even if it is 0, we have only 4 demanded quantities, no more. This is just theoretical, because if at price 0 everybody will request. I mean, just theoretically we are addressing this issue. Okay, so the WTP is represented by a stair. It's like just a stair going from up to down. And imagine in our reality, we don't address only for consumers. We address I mean, a huge number of buyers and sellers, not only 4. So we have millions of buyers and sellers interacting in the market. So we don't have these grain steps. We have extremely fine steps, and that is represented usually by just a straight line. And we will see how. So here we have just 4 steps because we have 4 customers or 4 buyers. And in that case, if we assume, or if we address the whole market, which is a competitive market with millions of buyers and sellers, in that case, we will have a fine steps representation that will just be like a straight line, okay? Now, at any point, at any quantity demanded, we will have something we call marginal buyer. The marginal buyer is a buyer who is willing to leave, or who will leave the market if the price is any higher. Now think about this, 300. So 300, the quantity demanded, any higher than 300, 0. But 300 and less, we have 1. Okay, take the next level. So of course, between 250, above 350, 250 and 300. So at 350, the marginal, we have 2 marginal buyer, we have 1 marginal buyer, sorry, not 2, because that's 300. So we have 1 marginal buyer here in this case, and this marginal buyer, if the price is higher than any higher than 250, will leave the market. We will just have the 1 at 300, and the same goes to at each step of those 175, 125, and so on. Okay. So if I ask a question about the marginal buyer, you say the buyer who would leave the market if the price were any higher, or if the price is any higher. Okay. This is for flea, the willingness to pay for flea. So this is the marginal price for flea. If I ask about the marginal price, you say 300 for flea, also 250 for Anthony, and so on. Okay. consumer surplus. So we haven't answered the question about the consumer surplus. What is it? What's the consumer surplus? So what does it represent? It's actually the amount the buyer is willing to pay minus the amount the buyer is actually paying. You may say, what is this philosophical sentence? It's not. Now, your willingness to pay may be more than the actual price. Now, let's just have a look here. I just gave an example earlier. Now, look at this. I'll just go to it quickly. Now, look. I'm sorry. Got into this. All right. The original table here we have. Now, we set the price 200. Now, the actual price is 200. It's just assumed. It may be less, it may be more. Look, someone is willing to pay 250 for it. Another person is willing to pay 300 for it. Okay? And they said they differ based on their need, their financial abilities, etc. There are a lot of factors. We are not addressing them right now. Okay? So the idea is your willingness to pay, or WTP in this case, may be higher than this by some certain amount, and that's exactly the consumer surplus. You benefit from the market. Like sometimes when you dedicate some budget to buy something, like let's say a smartphone, and you make your research, and for some reason some company is making like a discount for it, and you buy it, and it's below the budget that you dedicated for it, and then you feel like you gained something. You feel happy, or I gained, like I saved 200, 300, let's say. Well, that's exactly your consumer surplus. That's the idea of having this kind of concept from the market. So buyers usually have their benefit from the market based on the consumer surplus. That is the difference between their willingness to pay and the actual price. So if we think about a price of 260, for example, what's the willingness? The consumer surplus for Flea is 300. Her willingness to pay is 300 minus the actual price, that's 40. But for others is 0. Why? Because 260 is above Anthony, Chad, and whatever John is willingness to pay. So they will not be able to pay for the item since their willingness to pay is less than the actual price. If we are speaking about competitive market, we sum up all the consumer surplus all together for all buyers, and we will get the whole consumer surplus from the market, not just for one person. Now this is for Flea based on a price of 260. That is $40, for example. 300 minus 260, that's the total consumer surplus for Flea and for the market as well, because no one else would pay. It's above Anthony, above Chad, above John. Okay, so now look, it's like a rectangle, so we can calculate it based on multiplying the length and the width, or the height and the length, for example. Okay, now let's change the price. If we say the price is 220, now look, 220 includes two: willingness to pay 250 and 300. That means we will address Flea and Anthony. Okay, so we have someone else joining. So for Flea, it's already 300. We know minus 220, that's 80. We have Anthony, 250 minus 220, that's 30. We sum them up. So we have two representation. This is for Flea. This one. Let me get it back here. This one. Yes, for Flea. And this tiny one here, smaller one, for Anthony. We sum them up, these two rectangles. We will get the total consumer surplus from this market. This is just an assumed market. We have only limited number of buyers, right? So what is the idea? So what is it? How can we define it mathematically, as we are representing in this economy class? We can represent the consumer surplus by the area below the demand curve and above the price. So we have a price, whatever the price is, and we have a demand curve. Now, don't mind, it's a staircase here in this case, but it is between the demand curve and the price. Okay, so above the price, below the demand curve. All right, and do not get mixed it up with other things. It's not above here, it's below. Okay, so let's think about another example. Now, as I said, in a competitive market, we have millions of buyers and sellers and many transactions, and that's why we will have like a smooth demand curve like this. Let's say we speak about thousands in this case, so 5,000s, 10,000s, 15,000s, etc. And this is the price for a pair of shoes. Let's say at the price of 50, 5,000 pairs are demanded, and in that case, what we will be doing is we will see the demand at another price and see how things go. Let's say at the price, let's say suppose the price is 30, not 50. Okay, so just assume it. How about the quantity demanded? Now the quantity demanded, in that case, still again we are discussing like the consumers around 5,000 in the demanded quantity. So those who are demanding, they demand around 5,000 pair of shoes, and in that case, what will happen if the price is 30? Now here we can calculate the consumer surplus. So the actual price we have based on the willingness to pay and the actual price. So the willingness to pay is 50 for accumulated, the 5,000 demanded, accumulative, and the actual price is 30. So, well, you can see it. And in that case, how can we calculate the consumer surplus based on this? We said between the price and the demand curve, the area below all this. So this area is exactly a triangle, I'm sorry. So look at this. It's shaded now. This is a triangle, okay? How can we calculate the area of a triangle? We have a basic rule. We have the height and the base. It's like 0.5 or 1/2 multiplied the height and multiplied by the weight. So if you multiply the height and the weight, divide by 2, we will get the area of this triangle. And that's the total consumer surplus based on this case. So now, what is the point? The price at the price 30, actually we would have a demanded quantity of 15,000 pair of shoes. And that makes the whole consumer surplus based on this is the area of this triangle. Now we may think about marginal buyer here. Those who are, when the price is any higher than 30 would leave, so we would just have another area. Now we will see, we'll have an example about it. So I explained about the height, about the base, about the multiplication. Now if the price rises, what happens? Now look, this area shrinks. Of course the quantity will be reduced. Why? Any higher price means a lot of people or different types of people will leave the market. Why? For some reason, either their ability or willingness to pay even is not adequate. So what happens? We have two types of deductions. Now look, this kind of rectangle, I just shaded by the mouse here, and this kind of triangle, this one, I'm circling it, okay? So these two will be reduced from the overall consumer surplus based on price 30. So the rise here that we have from 30 to 40, what will happen? Will cause us losing two types of consumer surplus. One due to some buyers leaving the market, and the second one here is due to other buyers paying more or higher for the price or for the item. Sorry. So this is exactly it. Now what we are looking for is some buyers leaving the market, okay? And in this triangle is exactly the area that represents the consumer surplus loss due to the higher price, And then we have a higher price will also affect the overall consumer surplus and will create what we call a deduction by this rectangle shape. We can calculate these separately. How we can calculate it? Now look at this, 40 minus 30, that is 10. So this is the height, okay, or this is the width. And well, do not mind this representation because 10 from here and 10 from here are not exactly matching. This is not like properly scaled, but here we have 10 and here we have 10, that's a square. So if we multiply 10 by 10, that's the total area. So that's the loss or the fall in the total consumer surplus due to buyers paying more or higher price. If you want to calculate the fall in total consumer surplus due to buyers leaving the market, we would calculate this triangle. How can we calculate it? The base is 5. 15 minus 10. Now look, 15 minus 10, that's the base, that's 5. And here, the height is 40 minus 30, that's 10. So 1 over 2 multiplied by 10 multiplied by 5, that's 5 times 5, that's 25. Okay, so let's take another example. Now look at this practical task. Now we have a demand for whatever it is. It doesn't matter what it is, and if this one is multiplied by 1,000, you think about shoes, you think about shirts, you think about any product, okay? So we have the demand curve, and in that case, what do we have? Find marginal buyers' willingness to pay at quantity 10. So we need to link the quantity 10 here and intersect it with the demand curve and see the price. The available price is 30. So 30, anything higher than 30 will create a marginal buyer that leaves the market. When we say a marginal buyer, we don't speak about only one person. We speak about maybe thousands or maybe millions. Okay, it depends, because there are so many people who are not willing to pay more than 30 for many reasons. Okay, we need the consumer surplus at the price of 30. So we just found for quantity 10, we found the marginal price is 30. So we need to find the consumer surplus. The consumer surplus is the area between the price here, 30, and below the demand curve. So this triangle. Now this triangle, we would like to calculate. How do we calculate it? What's its base? 10 minus 0, that's 10. What's its height? 40 minus 30, that's 10. So 10 times 10 divided by 2, that's 50. Okay, so this is exactly the idea for the first part. The second one is, suppose that price falls to 20. So the price falls down here. How much will the consumer surplus increase due to buyers entering the market, exiting buyers paying lower price? Now, this is a good idea or a good question. Why we don't actually consider increment in the price, we consider like a fall in the price. So the price initially was 30, now the price becomes 20. So for this price 20, what do we need to calculate? We need to calculate two things. Now let me show you graphically, it will be easier. I explain about this, this is simple. So this was the first requirement. Having the total consumer surplus, we calculate the base and the height, we find the area. Now this is the change. The price drops or falls to 20, what happens? Now look, we have this rectangle or square in this case, okay, plus this triangle. Okay, now I have a highlight for them, this triangle. So those are new buyers entering the market. Now look, new buyers. Why? Because we move along the demand curve, we have new buyers joining in. Okay, so this rectangle is representing the additional consumer surplus because of buyers, new buyers entering the market. So how can we calculate it? 20 minus 10, that's 10. 30 minus 20, that's 10. So the base is 10, the height is 10. 10 times 10, that's 100. And 100 here will be divided by 2 to get the total area, because this is a triangle. So you multiply the base times the height, divide by 2. Okay. How about buyers paying lower price? Those buyers here available initially will pay lower price. So the lower price will give them more consumer surplus. And as I explained about it before, when you dedicate a budget and you pay lower than that budget, you feel that you gained something from the market. If you pay even lower than that, you would feel much better for gaining some benefit from the market. And this is what we refer to by consumer surplus. If the price is lower than the original price here, you will gain more. And this is the rectangle, or here in this case is square, representing your total gain. So this is an extra gain for those who are available here already. This is an extra gain for them. How do we calculate it? Multiply the height times the width, or the length times the width. That's 10 times 10, that's 100. Okay, we ask these questions usually during exams. We ask about the details of like either the fall in the consumer surplus due to buyers leaving the market, or the actually increment of the total consumer surplus due to people joining the market. And you can think of those as like common questions that we usually ask. Actually, that's it for the consumer surplus, and I have another session for the producer surplus, and then we will speak about the whole efficiency of the market. Until then, have a good time. Goodbye.